Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the third in a four-part series on the impact that terms and words from Greek and Roman mythology have had on our modern English language today. Now, in previous episodes, we have looked at the impact from names of gods. That actually took 2 episodes because there was a lot to talk about. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the impact on our modern language from names of human characters in Greek mythology. And then we're going to finish up by looking at the impact of terms that are related to names of monsters, places, religious ideas, basically just a grab bag, all the things that don't fit in any of the categories that we have been talking about so far. So let's get started with human characters. Greek mythology is very interesting in its portrayal of the origins of humans because unlike many mythologies, it doesn't necessarily have one fixed story as to where humans come from, but one of the most famous and influential stories is found in the works of the ancient Greek poet Hesiod. Now, according to Hesiod, there were multiple races of humans, and by races I don't mean the way we think of it today with regard to skin color or something like that. I mean that Zeus created individual groups of humans that then died out, and then he created another race of humans that then died out, and so on and so forth. One of the reasons that these early races of humans died out was because Zeus only created males, and so there was no reproduction, and eventually, of course, they just died out for lack of reproduction. However, eventually Zeus decided to create a human female, and of course, once human females were in existence, the human race was able to perpetuate itself. There's a whole story behind why Zeus created human females to begin with, but as with many stories from the ancient Mediterranean world, the creation of human females wasn't necessarily a great thing. It didn't necessarily end up being a great thing. According to Greek mythology, at least according to the story in the poet Hesiod, Zeus created the first woman whose name was Pandora, which means all gifts, and that has something to do with her creation if you go read the story. The reason Zeus created the first human woman was essentially as a distraction. He was worried that human men, who were all that existed at this point in time, would get too powerful if they were allowed to focus and essentially try to get more powerful and overthrow the gods, essentially. That's what Zeus and some of his comrades were worried about. So after Prometheus stole fire and gave it to humans, we talked about Prometheus before, after Prometheus did this against the will of Zeus decided to get back at humans, even though humans hadn't done anything, by giving them a human woman to distract them, the males, and to keep them from ever being able to challenge Zeus's rule. And this is where Pandora comes in. Pandora was the first human woman that was fashioned and sent down to, at this point, mankind, because again, it was only men. With her, she carried what we today call a box, but in the original stories was a jar. She carried a jar, and when she was accepted into mankind, she opened the jar, and all of the bad things of the world all flew out of the jar. Diseases and heartache and things like that. So again, the arrival of woman was also the arrival of a lot of bad things in Greek mythology. Again, there are many cultures, especially throughout the ancient Mediterranean, that have some kind of story that links the arrival of woman to the arrival of a lot of bad things. So the Greeks were not telling these stories in a vacuum. It seems to have been a wider cultural motif in that part of the world at that time period. Of course, we get other things that are called Pandora today, like, jewelry. That makes sense that Pandora would be a jewelry company. We're going to kind of go in roughly chronological order in the Greek story as we're talking about the humans in the Greek story. So Pandora, of course, was very early because she was the first human woman. But if we fast forward a little while, but still in a fairly archaic period of the Greek mythological story that specifically involves humans, we get to the princess Europa. Now, Europa was a Phoenician princess. Phoenicia was a part of the world that is on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, mostly in what is now the country of Lebanon, and maybe a little bit into Syria and Israel today, but regardless, mostly Lebanon. That is where Phoenicia was, and the Phoenicians were very important and very powerful, and they would sail all over the Mediterranean and basically bring their wares to other cultures. So Europa was a Phoenician princess, and Zeus looked down and desired Europa, and he did what he often did when he was trying to get somebody or seduce somebody. He turned himself into something else. In this case, Zeus turned himself into a beautiful bull and walked on the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean there in Lebanon. He knew that Europa, the princess, the local princess there, would often go down to the beach, and he also knew that she loved bulls. So, pretending to be a bull, he convinced her, I guess just being a beautiful bull, to ride him, to get on him, and then as soon as she did, he swam out to sea so that she was trapped and couldn't get off of him before, she realized that maybe this was not a normal bull. As the story goes, he swam all the way to Crete, which is across the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, from what is now Lebanon. And once he got to Crete, he revealed himself, said he was Zeus, and they became lovers, and she became the founder of a dynasty, a very early dynasty of Cretan kings, including the famous king Minos. So how did this name impact our language today? Well, first of all, you might know that the moons of Jupiter are all named after various lovers of Zeus, which kind of makes sense and is kind of like a little bit of an inside joke on the part of the astronomers who named them. But perhaps even more importantly than the moon of Jupiter that is called Europa, we actually get a whole continent from her name, and that continent, of course, is the continent Europe. Now, again, she was not a European princess in any kind of modern terms. She was an Asian princess. She came from the continent of Asia, but when she was kidnapped, she was brought from Asia to Europe, what we would today call Europe, at least the island of Crete, by Zeus, and she became the progenitor, the foremother of one of the early important European dynasties. And so ultimately her name got used to refer to that entire landmass that we call Europe today. Now, originally the names Europe and Asia had a much smaller referent. What I mean is that Europe was originally just the area around Greece and the Aegean on the western side of that body of water, and Asia was modern day Western and central Turkey, but then eventually those two terms spread in either direction to the point where Europe goes all the way to, Iceland today, and Asia goes all the way to Japan and Siberia, even though these were not the original reference of those terms. But it's interesting that our continent, Europe, comes from the name of this semi-legendary Phoenician princess that was abducted by Zeus in the story and taken to Europe and became the founder of an early European dynasty. How about Oedipus? Oedipus, we're getting a little bit later into the chronology of Greek mythology. Now, we are still several generations before the most famous event of Greek mythology, and that is the Trojan War, and we're going to get to some human characters from that here in a little bit. Oedipus is a few generations before that. Oedipus is famous because he was the son of a particular king and queen, and there was a prophecy that said that this baby was going to be trouble, and in those days, such prophecies were taken very seriously. So his parents decided to try to leave him outside to die. This actually wouldn't have been that uncommon in the ancient world, that if you had a baby and you didn't want the baby for whatever reason, but you didn't want to kill it with your own hands, because that would probably be terrible, you would leave it outside and you would wash your hands of it and say, if the gods want to save it, the gods will save the baby, but we're not going to take any action to try to raise this baby or save it from outdoors. Obviously, most babies would probably die in that scenario, but Oedipus gets saved and ultimately gets raised in a different Greek city. So Oedipus does not know who his father and his mother are. This proves to be unfortunate because there's a prophecy that says that Oedipus is going to kill his father, and that's of course exactly what he ends up doing, not realizing that it is his father. Then, to make matters even worse, he goes back to his hometown, which he doesn't know is his hometown, and ends up marrying his mother, whom again he did not know was his mother, because originally he didn't even know that he was adopted. His adopted parents didn't tell him this, which obviously turns out to be a little bit of a problem in the story. So Oedipus marries his mother, has children with her, and then eventually finds out, and as you would imagine, is very horrified. Now, Sigmund Freud, who always liked to read some of these Greek mythological stories and believe that there's something going on deep in the human psyche that is reflected in these stories, coined the term Oedipal complex for this Freudian idea that children are attracted to their parents of the opposite sex in some way. And specifically, the Oedipal complex is sons being attracted to their mothers in some way. Now, of course, Freud has been criticized for this, but he's still an important part of cultural discussion, and everyone has probably heard of him, and many people have heard of the edible complex, which again, he got straight from the name of Oedipus in Greek mythology. Now, there are a whole series of stories in Greek mythology that are what we call hubris stories. They are stories where some particular mortal goes over the line. He, or sometimes she, goes over the line, challenges the gods, doesn't know his or her place, and then gets really harshly punished for it. These are some of the harshest punishments that we have a record of in Greek mythology. And one of these stories is the story of Tantalus. Now, Tantalus was a king, but more than that, he had a special relationship with the gods. And one time the gods actually came to dinner at his house, which would have been an unspeakable honor for the gods to come to your house and for you to entertain them, essentially. For unknown reasons, Tantalus decided that he was going to test the gods and see if they were really as smart and as all-knowing. They weren't all-knowing in Greek mythology, but if they were even just paying attention, if they were even really any better than anyone else. So what Tantalus did, and again, not clear why he did this either, but Tantalus killed his own son Pelops, cooked him, and then served him to the gods when the gods came to eat at his house. And all of the gods except one, Demeter, were totally on it and knew immediately what had happened, and they were obviously very unhappy at Tantalus for killing his own son and cooking him and serving them, but also unhappy at the trick. And so they sent Tantalus to Tartaros, which is the kind of like the hell of Greek mythology. Hades is not really the hell of Greek mythology because it's just the bland underworld where almost everyone goes when they die. It's not a punishment or fiery or anything like that. But Tantalus is the maximum security prison that is in one corner of Hades, and it's more like our modern conceptions of hell today. It's reserved for really bad people, and it's got a lot of fire and whips and things like that. So Tantalus goes to Tartaros, and he gets a particular punishment that is tailored to what he did. We're going to see that a lot of these punishments are tailored to what these individuals have done in life to so offend the gods. So Tantalus is placed in a small pit, and there's water below him, and there's fruit from a fruit tree above him. So you would think he would be set as far as his food and water needs are concerned, but every time he tries to dip down to drink the water, it goes down, and so he can't reach it. And every time he tries to reach up to grab a fruit, the water goes down, so he can't reach it. So he's always within sight of really great food and clean water, but he can't ever eat or drink. And this is actually where we get our word tantalize from. This idea that there is something that is just out of your reach, and you can see it, but you can't get it. That's where our word tantalize comes from. It comes from the story of Tantalus in Greek mythology. And there's also an element, tantalum, that comes from his name as well. How about Sisyphus? Sisyphus is another famous criminal that is located in Tartarus in Greek mythology. Sisyphus has a very interesting story. Sisyphus talked a little bit about some of Zeus's exploits, and Zeus wasn't happy about this. So Zeus called to death Thanatos to go get Sisyphus. In other words, it's Sisyphus' time to die. We're going to take him to Hades so he can't blab on me, Zeus, anymore. But Sisyphus is not going to go easily, unlike most people who, if death showed up at your door, you'd curl up in a ball and start pleading and crying, and then he would grab you and that would be it. Oh no, Sisyphus had a plan. Sisyphus started, having a conversation with Death. He started chatting him up to try to soften him up a little bit, see if there are any weaknesses. Death was holding some chains that he was going to chain Sisyphus up with, and Sisyphus says, "Oh, those chains look really cool. Can you show me how they work on yourself? I just want to see, before you use them on me." And Death, I guess maybe not being used to being chatted up like this, is like, "Oh, sure." And so he shows Sisyphus how the chains work on himself, and then Sisyphus grabs Death as he's chained up and shoves him in his closet, and then goes back to his regular daily life, whatever he was doing that day. Now, a few days go by, but people are now not dying all over the world, and Hades gets upset and complains to Zeus, and Zeus puts the pieces together and realizes that Death was last seen at Sisyphus' house and is now missing in action. So he sends Hermes down to check out the situation, and he busts Death out of, Sisyphus' closet or whatever, and of course drags Sisyphus down to the underworld. So Sisyphus manages to cheat Death, but it doesn't really last for very long. However, Sisyphus is still not out of tricks because he's that clever. He gives his wife explicit instructions not to bury his body, which would have been considered a huge problem, or a huge religious problem in the ancient world, just like honestly in many cultures from around the world. It's the family's solemn obligation to deal with the body in the proper way. So Sisyphus' wife doesn't deal with the body in the proper way. She throws it out in the street, and this is what Sisyphus told her to do. So Sisyphus gets down to the underworld and starts talking to Hades and Persephone and says, "Can you believe that my wife is treating my body this way? She is so rude. Can I go back and tell her off or something?" And Hades and Persephone feel so bad and are so shocked by this treatment by his wife that they say, yeah, you go back and tell your wife that she's a terrible person. So he gets to go back from the underworld to the mortal world, and then he just re-inhabits his body. He basically tricked everybody, and then he lives out his life to old age, and then of course eventually has to go back to the underworld. Unfortunately, this time everybody is waiting for him and everybody is ready for him, and he's not going to get out of it this time. So he is sent to Tartarus and forced to roll this boulder up this steep hill for eternity. And as soon as he almost gets it to the top, it rolls all the way back down and he has to start all over again. So you can see that this story is kind of a metaphor for what Sisyphus tried to do. He cheated death, not once, but twice, and he got a longer life out of it. But in the end, what did he really get out of it? Because he's still dead, and now he just has a punishment for all of eternity to remind him of why his efforts really weren't worth much in the end. And this is where we get the adjective Sisyphean from. If you were engaged in a Sisyphean task, it's like rolling a boulder up a hill for eternity only to see it come all the way back down as soon as you almost get it to the top. It's something that is frustrating and ultimately useless. That is a Sisyphean task. Another individual who challenged the gods and for whom, things didn't end up too well was Arachne. Arachne was a girl who was very skilled at weaving and sewing and those kind of arts. And of all the gods and goddesses, Athena was the goddess of domestic arts, among, of course, many other things. And so Arachne was so good at sewing and weaving that she thought that she was better than Athena. And so she openly said that she was the best in the cosmos at this, even better than the goddess Athena. Now, of course, this is a pretty big no-no. You don't want to challenge the gods to something like this, but Arachne did it anyways. Athena hears about this, and Athena is not one of the nastier gods or goddesses, so she actually takes the form of an old woman and goes down to Arachne and says, "Hey, you might not want to say that. You might want to cool it, because Athena's going to hear about this, and she's not going to be happy." And Arachne's like, "Nah, she can come at me, bro, because I am the best, and I can take her." So the old woman, who was really Athena, is like, "Okay, you said it." So she turns herself into Athena, challenges Arachne to a weaving contest. And actually, Arachne does surprisingly well in the weaving contest. Depending on the version of the story, she either ties Athena or maybe even beats Athena. Either way, Athena is still more powerful than her and not very happy. So she destroys the tapestry that Arachne wove, and as a punishment for her hubris, turns her into the first spider. And so this is where we get all of our arachne words from that have something to do with spider. They go back to this particular individual in Greek mythology, this human who got turned into a spider by Athena, both as a punishment for hubris, but also as a reward for being such a good weaver. Athena didn't want to just kill her. She decided to, let her keep doing her thing out there in the world, just not as a human. So when you see a spider, or when the ancient Greeks saw a spider, they would have thought of this story. How about Narcissus? Narcissus is, of course, a particularly interesting character in Greek mythology, and as you probably know, we get the word narcissist from this character, Narcissus. Narcissus was a young man who was very attractive, and so he had a number of different suitors, both male and female, and he rejected all of them because he was too interested in himself. And ultimately, he gets cursed to fall in love with himself. And so one day he sees his reflection in a pool of water, and he thinks that it is the most beautiful person that he has ever seen. Remember, he rejected all these other people. He sees himself, and he just becomes enamored of himself. Of course, you can see why we would get the word narcissist from this, as someone who is sort of just enamored with themselves. Now, depending on the version of the story, he either dies because he just can't, tear his eyes away from himself, and so he dies of thirst or hunger or whatever. Sometimes he commits suicide because he realizes that that's him in the reflection, and he can never be with himself, right? And so either way, it doesn't end well for Narcissus. Another attractive individual in Greek mythology that things don't end well for is Adonis. Adonis has a whole backstory that we don't need to get into, but Adonis was revered as one of the most attractive men that ever lived in Greek mythology. And of course, Aphrodite is always scouting around for all of the attractive people. Aphrodite always loves attractive people of any gender because Aphrodite is the goddess of being attractive, right? So she hears about Adonis and goes down and makes him her boyfriend. Even though he is immortal, Aphrodite says, yep, that's the most attractive guy I've ever seen. So she makes him her boyfriend. Unfortunately, some of the other gods get jealous and arrange so that he gets killed on a boar hunt. He's out hunting a wild boar and the boar gores him to death. So the moral of the story is that beauty is fleeting. No matter how attractive you are, it's going to come to an end, whether death or whatever, right? That's sort of the moral of the story. The interesting thing is that the story of Adonis goes a little bit deeper than this. It seems to come from the area of Phoenicia because the name Adonis is actually connected to a Semitic name, a Semitic word, not necessarily a name originally that just means Lord. It's actually connected to one of the names for God, Adonai, in the Hebrew Bible. This is not a god. This is a mortal. It just means Lord originally, so this was probably originally a Semitic god of some kind that got imported into Greece. And today, when we refer to an Adonis, we refer to a attractive young man. That's essentially what an Adonis is. So most of the religious background of this story of Adonis has sort of been removed when we use the term today, but it does ultimately come from a religious observance. And there was a whole festival to him in Greece as well that I won't get into now. Now, I know you have all heard the story of Heracles. He's also known as Hercules. Heracles was his original Greek name, and then Hercules was the Roman mangling of his name. Of course, there's a very famous Disney movie, Hercules, after his Roman name today, and there are many differences and some similarities between the Disney movie and the actual story in Greek mythology. Now, this is not the time or place to go through an in-depth discussion of who this individual was, but you probably know that he was considered the greatest hero in all of Greek mythology. And of course, we get this particular adjective, Herculean, from the Roman version of his name, Hercules, instead of Heracles. Same guy, essentially. Anything that is Herculean is giant. It would be impossible for a mere mortal, or at least a normal mortal, but you have to be someone like Hercules or Heracles to be able to accomplish it. He was known for his 12 labors and his feats of strength and for his overcoming of impossible odds to reach his goals. Now we're finally getting to the generation of the Trojan War. Heracles was dead before the Trojan War. He was only like a generation before it. But of course, as you probably know, if you know about the story of the Trojan War, the story of Troy, Achilles was the greatest hero who actually fought in the Trojan War. He was the son of a mortal and a goddess, a nymph, and so he already had some what we might call good genetics, and so he was considered to be the fastest and best looking and strongest hero that ever fought, at least that fought in the age of the Trojan War. Famously, he gets shot in the heel, and according to at least some later versions of the myth, the reason that he is vulnerable in the heel is because his mother, the Athena Thetis, dipped him in the river Styx as a baby, but held him by the heel, and so he was invulnerable everywhere he got dipped, but was still vulnerable in his heel. So ultimately, he gets killed by an arrow wound to the heel. Now, again, I hasten to say that that version of the story is actually not found in our oldest texts, because that also almost makes him seem too good, that he's invulnerable everywhere except his heel. It seems like in the earliest text, he was just really good, and so if you tried to shoot him with an arrow, he would just move because he was really fast. And then later on, the legend kept accreting more, shall we say, supernatural elements to him. But of course, we get the idea of the Achilles heel. Not the idea, I mean, I think most of us have two of them. This part of your body called the Achilles tendon, which is down near your heel. Of course, this comes from the ancient Greek hero Achilles. Another individual who was living at the time of the Trojan War was the Trojan princess Cassandra. So she was on the other side. Achilles was a Greek warrior, and Cassandra was a Trojan princess. So she was the sister of many of the Trojan heroes, such as Hector. and of course Paris. Now Cassandra, again, was a princess, and Apollo was interested in her, and Apollo promised that if they became lovers, he, Apollo, would give her the gift of prophecy. Remember, Apollo is the god of prophecy and some other things related to it. And Cassandra said, yeah, that sounds great, and so she jumped at it, and Apollo gave her the gift of prophecy, but then she decided to go back on this and say, I don't really want to be your girlfriend after all. So Apollo, according to different versions of the story, maybe he couldn't take back the gift, or maybe he just didn't want to take back the gift. But either way, he said, okay, you can keep the gift. You can still have the gift of prophecy, but I'm going to add a curse to it. I'm going to add this terrible curse that you will always be right, but no one will ever believe you. So you will always see all of the bad things that are coming, and you will try to tell everyone you love and try to warn them, and they will all just not take you seriously. They'll all just sort of brush you off. So you're going to see everything coming, and you're not going to be able to stop it. And so this is essentially the curse that Apollo gives to Cassandra. So today when we talk about a Cassandra, it's referring back to this particular character with this particular fate in Greek mythology. A Cassandra is someone who's always saying bad things are going to happen, and then nobody ever believes them. Of course, we have to wait and see whether those bad things happen or not. But in the case of Cassandra, all of the bad things that she foresaw, such as the sack of Troy and the killing of her parents and most of her siblings, did come to pass, and she had to witness it with her own eyes without being able to stop it. Going back to the Greek side, there's a hero on the Greek side named Ajax. Actually, if you know the story, there are two heroes on the Greek side named Ajax. They are not related. They have different parents, and oftentimes they are kept separate by the names of their parents. Sometimes they are kept separate simply by being called Ajax the Greater and Ajax the Lesser, or something like that. Either way, there are these two Ajaxes, and we have various things in English today that are named after these Ajaxes. Ajax the Greater, who is the one who is the bigger character in the story and comes up more often, is really known for his strength and his great size. He's called the bulwark, it's a hard word, of the Greeks. So he just stands there, and it's really hard for anybody to get past him, especially with his big shield and his armor and his long spear. So there's all sorts of things that we get today, products, sports teams that are named after Ajax, especially Ajax the Greater in Greek mythology. Now, another set of characters in Greek mythology that actually pop up quite a bit are the Amazons. Now, the Amazons are is a semi-legendary tribe of warrior women who do not live in Greece. So these wouldn't have been people that the Greeks saw all the time, but they told stories about them living out in what's now eastern Turkey, or maybe in what's now Ukraine or southern Russia, out on the steppes. And we think that there may be some historical basis to this. This doesn't seem like one of the things that was totally made up or supernatural or anything like that in Greek mythology. So every once in a while, the Amazons pop up. They ride on horseback. Again, they are a tribe of warrior women who basically fight just like men would on horseback at that particular time period. Now, the Greeks and other neighboring cultures did not let their women do this. They didn't let their women fight like this, so they thought this was pretty incredible and maybe a little bit scary that women were even capable of doing this, and they were always a little bit worried that some women, were going to take them over with their battle prowess. So the Amazons always fight male heroes in Greek mythology, and the male heroes always win in Greek mythology because this was important for the Greek men, at least, to see that the men were putting these Amazon women in their place. But regardless, there was still some respect there. The men respected the women from far away for being able to even fight them in the first place and fight them pretty effectively. So anytime we talk about an Amazon as a class of woman today, this goes back to this idea of women who are ferocious and strong and powerful. The Amazon River, even though it's in South America and has nothing to do with Greek mythology, was named after this story or this set of stories in Greek mythology because when an explorer was going up what is today called the Amazon River, about over 400 years ago at this point, he claims to have been attacked by a group of warrior women, and of course his mind immediately went to the story of the Amazons in Greek mythology, and so he he named it the Amazon River. And named after the Amazon River, ultimately, is the corporation Amazon, where you buy a bunch of stuff, right? This was sort of a randomly chosen name in the mid-90s for this particular corporation, but it was ultimately named after the Amazon River, which in turn was named after the Amazons of Greek mythology, so it all goes back to them. Another hero on the Greek side, and one who gives his name to what is often called the sequel to the Iliad. The Iliad is the best and biggest story of the Trojan War that we still have. The sequel to the Iliad is called the Odyssey, and it's named after this particular guy, Odysseus. Now, Odysseus is known as the craftiest person on the Greek side. He is well known for his brains, which is not to say that he can't, survive a physical tussle, but he is often being put in situations where he has to use his mind to get out of difficult situations. And he's the one who ultimately comes up with the Trojan horse trick that enables the Greeks, spoiler alert, to take the city of Troy. However, everyone has to get home, back to Greece, after they sack the city of Troy. Many of them have difficult journeys, and the one who has the most difficult journey of all is Odysseus. He gets blown off course into the central and western Mediterranean and has a whole series of crazy adventures that are narrated in the story that is named after him, called the Odyssey. So today, we use this term all the time to refer to any kind of long voyage filled with adventure. There's a car named after it that is probably meant to inspire the idea of going on an adventure or something like that. But it all goes back to the name of this particular Greek hero, Odysseus. And then finally, the last human in Greek mythology that we're going to talk about that has lent his or her name to some words in English today is the individual Mentor. Mentor was one of Odysseus's advisors. Odysseus was a king of a small island named Ithaca on the west coast of Greece. Mentor was there, and Mentor was left behind to take care of Odysseus' young son, Telemachus, when Odysseus went to war. His wife, Penelope, is there as well. So Mentor basically is a guide, and he's an old man, he's wise. But then often in the Odyssey, the goddess Athena takes the form of the human mentor to give Odysseus and others advice. So originally, in the Odyssey, this character Mentor is oftentimes giving advice. He's an older individual. He's been there, done that. And of course, if it's really the goddess Athena, he really knows what he is talking about because he's actually a goddess in disguise. But either way, we get our generic word mentor from the name of this particular individual in Greek mythology, and of course we just use it as a common noun, not a proper noun anymore, for someone who maybe is a little bit older, maybe is a little bit wiser, who is going to help you and give you advice and get you to your goal, or at least give you what you need, give you the knowledge and skills that you need to get where you want to go. That's all we're going to talk about. There are probably other humans that I have left out. I decided this was long enough as it is, just with these particular human characters and this terminology that we get from those human characters in Greek mythology in English today. Stay tuned for part 4, and we're going to wrap it up and talk about all of the other terms then. See you then.